Red's Fly Shop, this is Bob. How may I help you today?
Look at that. Woo! Dry flies. This is part one of a three-part series. I will have a casual discussion on fly selection for dry flies, nymphs, and streamers. Today you're going to see dry flies. Stay tuned, subscribe to the channel. You will see nymphs and then streamers released about a week apart. Hope you enjoy the video. But if you're into fly fishing and either you're hopefully a beginner, I mean, I really want to make this inclusive for everybody, no matter what stage you're at. So whether you're a beginner or maybe a salty old vet, watch all the way through. We're going to talk about dry flies, nymphs, and streamers, which are the three primary categories of fly types for trout fishing. So, well, for all fly fishing for that matter. So we'll start with dry flies. So in fly fishing, or the history of fly fishing, fly rods were really designed to be able to take and propel something weightless out to not great distance, but some distance, and be able to imitate an insect, likely landing on the water or drifting in the stream. And that's really the origin of fly fishing. That's why we have thick fly lines, so that we can use that mass to load the rod and carry the weightless fly out there. So dry fly fishing typically is going to be plan A for most anglers. I would always encourage you to either start with dry flies at the beginning of your fly fishing journey and hopefully at the beginning of your day. It's a wonderful casting experience and incredibly effective. You can, for a whole bunch of different reasons. Before we dive into the exact patterns, I've got a whole bunch of flies sitting out here right now that I'll show you. Let's kind of raise the camera. I got tons of flies here, and I'm going to run through some of my favorite patterns. But before we do that, I want to make a case for just doing a little bit more dry fly fishing than you are now, even if it's for short periods of time when you get out. You can move a dry fly around a river much faster than a weighted fly. It changes direction quickly, you're more mobile, and when a dry fly lands on the surface, if you imitate it well, you have the entire water column covered from one spot, versus when we're fishing weighted flies, we may need to get them in a particular part of the water column. A dry fly suspended and essentially trapped on the surface is vulnerable to the trout at any depth of water. So we're going to run through some of my favorite flies here. Dry flies are going to fall into several categories, and I'm just kind of shooting from the hip here, so I don't have like a script that I'm reading from or anything. But we're going to have small match the hatch dry flies. That's going to be something like, let's just say, a little caddis fly like this. And that's parachute caddis from Rio, one of my favorite all-around dry flies in general. So that would be like a small match the hatch dry fly, and we'll run through a handful of those as well. Out west, I'll show you this fly again. We're going to have stoneflies. That's a golden stonefly imitation. That's an Emma's stonefly from Rio. Hey there, trout, come eat me. So you can see the movement there. So we have larger dry flies that might match a stonefly pattern. Of course, we're going to have grasshoppers. I'll show you a nice big one here. That one's pretty easy to identify what that is, even though he's missing a leg. And that's a Moorish hopper from Rio as well. So we're going to have hoppers, which would fall in the category of a terrestrial. A terrestrial is something that comes from outside the water and in the water. And a lot of our larger flies can imitate terrestrials. Let's show you that one right there. Could be a mud wasp, beetle, cicada, cricket, could be a whole bunch of different things. Let's leave it up to the trout's imagination exactly what that's imitating. So that would be like, there's stoneflies, there's terrestrials, and then we're just going to have big attractor flies. And big attractor flies, let's just grab one right here. You may have heard of before. If you fly fished for more than about a week, you've probably heard of this fly. So that's a chubby Chernobyl, and chubby Chernobyl is also in that large dry fly category as well. And again, it could be every trout's greatest fantasy. So dry flies, let's show you one more. Why not? We're at it. And we're just about to this hatch right here on the Yakima River. That imitates a Yakima River summer stonefly, and that's a water walker from Montana Fly Company. And I can't remember the exact name of that one, but I'll try to pop it up in the video description there. So as you can see, there are lots of different sizes of flies, and I'm not super organized with my small dry flies. They're little itty bitties, but In this box, there's going to be a fly to match most every hatch on a river throughout the West. When it comes to dry fly fishing, the number one most important thing about dry fly fishing is not the fly that you have on necessarily. A trout out here today could eat a big variety of different insects. The presentation is 90% of it. Making a good presentation to the trout is fundamental. So just serving that fly up, and there's lots of different analogies, but you could be at like, you know, a cocktail party or a wedding or something, and a server could walk by with a plate of hors d'oeuvres. And if they walk by kind of in the distance across the room, if you're starving, you'll chase them down. And that would be the equivalent of a hungry trout that goes and gets a bad presentation. Inversely, maybe that server comes up and says, would you like a shrimp tater tot? And just serves it right up to you, in which case you go, absolutely. I didn't know I wanted a shrimp tater tot, but now that they're here, they're right in front of me and look really good. Nothing weird or suspicious is happening. Of course you're gonna eat one of those. So your presentation is paramount. You know, good casting, good turnover with the leader, making sure that leader's at full extension, and lots of other technical skills. But we're gonna drive the conversation primarily towards flies. So presentation, 90% of it. Now, part of presentation is gonna be being able to see and track your fly in the river so that you know maybe there's a suspicious spot in the river, like a stick, a log, maybe an area that's a little choppier, or a couple of current lines that are squeezing together and condensing surface litter in the form of maybe a little bubble line or a foam line. We have a saying around here, we say the foam is home when we're guiding, because those foam lines or those foam bubbles that are out on a river like this are getting rafted to the same place as the insects are. So this fly right here, let me turn it over, and I'm just going to give you an example of what you might look for in some of your dry flies. This is called a dry humper from Rio. It's designed around the classic humpy style dry fly, and it has a little teeny bit of foam on that hump across the back right there. It helps give it good buoyancy, and then you've got a white wing. The white wings on these flies are for your viewing pleasure. That way I can track this fly, I can see it even in heavy chop. So visibility on your small dry flies is one thing that's very important. I tend to start with flies that are easy to see. I'll show you that parachute caddis from Rio again. I just want to show you the parachute post on that. Floats good, mends good. It's got small dry flies having flies with good buoyancy characteristics, so that way when you do make a mend or an adjustment, or you just hit a little whirlpool, the fly isn't sunk each and every time, but I can actually see where the fly is so that I can either target a very specific and suspicious spot, or maybe I'm seeing a fish feed. Maybe I'm seeing a fish feed and boil on the surface. Another fly that I think is great for starting out, either your fly fishing journey or the day, is just one of these parawolves. So it's tied with a parachute hackle. That's the grizzly hackle that is going to sit flush with the water, and then we've got a wolf style set of double calf hair wings there on top, and a purple body. There aren't a lot of purple insects floating around, but the fish isn't going to mistake that fly or that offering with sticks, twigs, and leaves and other things like that. So I like to run attractors like that parawolf or any number of the different dry humpers in the different colors when I'm first starting out. If there's not a hatch where I'm physically seeing an insect on the water, those little attractors are very effective. Now we can't forget about one of the most classic dry flies of all time, and that's going to be a stimulator. That's a very small stimulator right there, and that stimulator imitates a moving insect. Okay, that's why we have all that hackle, we have that elk hair. And when you consider what a small dry fly is going to look like when it's actually perched up on the surface tension, all of the hackles and the spikes and the feathers that are on the fly are going to be pushing down on those hydrogen bonds. And if you've ever seen an underwater photo of a fly resting on the surface, it's amazing. This fly, as it rolls around, looks like it's moving when it's not. And stimulators can be, very, very small, or they can be much larger. That's the classic orange stimulator, and I think it's actually the fly that's in the Reds logo, and the most iconic Western dry fly of all time. But the stimulator is interesting because what it's imitating is an insect that's perched up on the surface tension that's a flight risk. So this thing looks like it's trying or is about to fly away. So trout oftentimes will just lose their minds because they see kind of this fleeing opportunity, and so they'll just smash that stimulator on the surface. But I think it's important to have a couple of stimulators in your box, especially when you're searching and there's not a lot of visible hatches present. So there's literally thousands and thousands of dry flies out there. Let's jump to talking about emerging dry flies. So there's several facets of dry fly fishing. They're searching in the absence of a hatch with little attractors or even big attractors that we'll talk about next. And then there's emergers. That's a King Zeppelin's caddis, and that looks like a little grub, essentially. That's a little caddis body, that blimpy looking thing on the back, and then it's got that elk hair that makes it look really busy. This would be an example of a fly I might fish just barely under the surface, and that could be an emerger. That's an insect that's coming from the bottom of the river, moving up in the water column, settling onto the surface, and as it's emerging and coming out of the water, that's a fish's preferred time to feed on small dry flies, and that's when we try to match the hatch. When you fish an emerger, and I can't go through every possible scenario here in the time that we're going to spend on this, but when I'm going to fish an emerger that's just under the surface, unless I'm very close to the fish and I can see really well, a lot of times I'm going to take a visible caddis fly or a mayfly or whatever I happen to be using, and I'll run that emerger just 6 to 12 inches behind that, and I can use one fly that it may still get bit, it's matching the hatch, but it's visible and I can track its location and its behavior, and I'll let this emerger float just barely under the surface behind it, because much of the time you're seeing fish boil, especially when you're not seeing their head, you're just seeing a back and a tail or a swirl. Much of the time they're taking those flies just under the surface as that bug is approaching the surface. It's safer for the trout, and the insect itself is not a flight risk, so it's more vulnerable. Those fish can make very patient, methodical rises up to the surface. Now I'll show you one or two more small dry flies, and we'll just give you, we'll show you what a parachute dun looks like. And this is essentially a parachute Adams in a pale morning dun color. And a parachute Adams is a classic gray pattern that imitates a lot of different things. But a parachute dun, and I'll show you the side profile too, but a parachute dun is a wonderful, wonderful pattern that can be universally fished for lots of different situations. Mayflies, caddisflies, little stoneflies, lots of different things. The thing about a parachute dun, and I'm gonna pinch it by the post here and show you the body, is it does a nice job of playing both the dry fly and emerger. So that body right there looks like a nymph floating on or just under the surface, with part of the body above the water surface and then the body of the nymph under the surface. So a parachute dun in a variety of colors, and even the classic parachute Adams is a wonderful small dry fly. Have a variety of those in your box, everything from a size 14 down through a 20. You don't need a lot of them, but you definitely have to have some of those small dry flies. Now this is my caddis that I prefer late in a hatch, either late in the day or if the hatch is a couple weeks old, and that's called a hen wing caddis by Rio. And a lot of times people look at these really natural looking bugs, and historically a lot of them didn't float real well. A traditional tent wing caddis always seemed to get soggy and it was hard to see. The hen wing caddis, when you put this up against our Granham's caddis, which is the most common caddis in North America, the Granham's caddis looks almost identical. You can see the black head on there, the olive colored body, and then the very natural kind of sedgy wing on that. The difference here is it has a very stiff hackle on the top, so it skates really well, it mends really well, it stays buoyant, and is actually quite easy to see, even though it's a very, very dark, natural caddis color. Let's talk about floating, okay? So before we dive into big dry flies, let's talk a little bit about floating. I am not a floating snob. There's 6 or 8 different varieties that we sell at Reds, and I'm sure all of them work fine. I'll just share with you what I use. I use just a standard loon, a quell, for almost everything. So that's just my floating. I know how it works. I know how much to use. I'm really comfortable with that floating and the application and getting it right. You can use Flyagra or whatever. I just don't like the smell of that stuff. It smells like gasoline. But floating is really important. So with floating, I'm not going to demonstrate, but you'll take just one little drop of floating, smear it through your fingers like this, and then just evenly coat the wing fibers and the top of the fly Certain flies, you just want to coat a little bit on the top, especially when you've got highly selective fish. If you want to get that illusion that half of the fly is underwater like an emerger and the other rest of it is out there in the outer world and emerging, a little bit of floating just on the tip top is good. But there is one thing I'll say about floating. The only other floating I carry is also a loon product, and it's called lock saw. And that's for a very specific material. And I grabbed a big fly here just so it would show up better. But that really fine fiber is called CDC. And that is from the oil gland of a duck. It's very fine, it's very buggy, but it has a tendency to stick together and not float very well. The lock saw is a little bit better for CDC materials. And CDC is something, it's like a micro marabou. If you don't have any flies with CDC on there, it's just like a little really fine marabou style feather for the wing. The lock saw is going to perform a little bit better on CDC, and that's what you're going to find on a lot of your emerger patterns is CDC. But those are my two types of floatants that I use. All right, big dry flies. That is a salmon fly. That's the king of all Western hatches. The salmon fly is the iconic hatch. If you've seen a movie or river runs through it, you see the big salmon fly crawling up. I think it was Norman's neck on the video. That's a salmon fly. So big dry fly fishing is also going to be match the hatch to a degree, but we're going to create some illusions with rubber legs and hackle and hair and colors and things. Maybe a lost opportunity for a fish, something unique, something they haven't seen before. And fish eat opportunistically. They're going to eat June bugs, beetles, praying mantis, all sorts of crazy stuff. Big dry fly fishing is most effective typically when you're able to cover a lot of water. So you either have a large expanse that you can hike and wade and cover water very quickly, or you're in a drift boat floating down the Yakima River Canyon like you see behind me here. Big dry flies are great for searching and covering a lot of water quickly. If you're confined to fishing a very short area and a small area, generally I'm going to lean towards smaller dries or emergers or little dry dropper setups or something, maybe even subsurface. So when it comes to match the hatch, most Western stoneflies, there's a salmon fly here that's an Emma stone in the salmon fly variety. I love the way that thing scoots, skitters, performs, mends. It looks like it's moving when it's not on the water due to the generous stiff hackle that's on that pattern. That's one of my favorites for both summer stonefly fishing, as well as just an attractor. On the other end of the spectrum, this is a little water walker squalla. The squalla stonefly hatch is a famous hatch throughout most of the West, especially on the Yakima River. So when you're choosing big stoneflies, there's going to be a seasonality to it. Maybe you're going to a shop or a location where you have access to some information about what time of year these different bugs are hatching. That's going to drive your decision making on whether you're throwing squallas or salmon flies, or the next one. The golden stone. So golden stone, they're not as bright yellow here on the Yakima as they are throughout some of the Rocky Mountain states or further out in kind of the, I jokingly call the Rockies the Midwest, out in the Midwest. But there's that's a juicy stone from Rio, and so that'd be a golden stone, and you can choose your stonefly patterns based on what's actually hatching out there. And I showed you one already, and I'll show you it again. This is a water walker stone, and we have an amazing summer stonefly hatch on the Yakima River. It's almost as big as a salmon fly. And the water walker is a guide's favorite for this hatch out here from Montana Fly Company. So you have a couple options. You can match the hatch for big Western fly fishing, and you're going to choose stoneflies that have, there's some intelligence-driven decisions. And then we kind of jump in, if we're just throwing attractors all the time, we kind of jump into the world of chubby Chernobyls. And that's just a black and peacock colored chubby Chernobyl from Rio right there. And black is buggy. When I start to fish dry flies in that number 8 through number 12 range, black is usually my first choice. Lots of bugs are black. Fish don't confuse it with a lot of other things on the surface. I usually avoid real natural colors like olives once it's kind of midsummer. And the big dry fly fishing is really going to be confined, with the exception of squalla stoneflies. It's really going to be driven towards the warm spring, summer months, and early fall. So there's some seasonality to the big dry fly fishing, with the exception of in October caddis, which we get massive hatches here in the fall. And when it comes to October caddis, I'm going orange stimulator pretty much all day, every day on that. Now, in the world of hoppers and terrestrials, hoppers are like anything else. They hatch just like anything else. A hopper has a life cycle where it lives underground. A certain time of the year, those grubs crawl out of the ground. They start jumping around and hopefully populate the riverbanks and the trout's stomach. Hoppers can be fished in peach colors like that. That's a juicy hopper from Rio in peach, and that's kind of on the smaller end of the spectrum for most of the hoppers I fish. And hoppers do tend to get a little bit bigger throughout the summer. They come out of the ground pretty good size, depending on the specific species, the hopper, but it's easy to just take a look around, and if you're seeing hoppers of a certain size and color, match it. Hoppers are really fun to fish and easy to understand. That's a panty dropper hopper from Solitude, but a lot of the peach and tan colors imitate a hopper really well, and imitate the hopper's light colored belly. Most hoppers are going to have very light colored bellies. I'll fish a black hopper once in a while, but I think that better imitates cicadas and June bugs, mud wasps, and some of the other junk that you're just seeing kind of fall into the river from surrounding areas. Now, one more note just about big dry fly fishing. There's a fundamental difference between a fly that has hackle and hair, like that Emma Stone, which is if I'm just fishing a single dry fly, I'm gonna fish something that's probably got a combination of both hackle and hair, because when the sunlight comes down through those hackles and that hair, it makes the bug look alive, like it's moving when it's actually not. Inversely, just a pure silhouette type chubby Chernobyl, if I'm fishing that, a chubby Chernobyl by itself, it's probably because it's extremely low light, would be the most common use case. The big white wing doesn't necessarily look all that buggy, so I'm going to use chubby Chernobyls in two situations. One, typically low light, or if I'm going to suspend a weighted nymph underneath the dry fly, the chubby Chernobyl is king when it comes to running dry droppers. It floats good, it's easy to see, it's buoyant. You can mend it with that nymph on the other end and not yank it underwater. There's certainly lots I'm leaving out here, but I am going to share one more family of terrestrials that I think is really critical, especially in areas that maybe have a little bit more pressure or spooky trout. And the Yakima River falls in this category later in the summer after the guides have given them a full summer's education. We call that summer school shop. But we had to tie these for years, and now we have an unbelievable selection of crane flies. Crane flies are a very, very important larger dry fly in clear water in situations where the trout are highly selective. So crane flies, they lay their eggs in the water oftentimes in riparian environments, and then those eggs will actually propagate in the water. And if you follow along this three-part series, you'll actually see crane fly larvae in the nymph series, so those will actually live in the water. But the crane fly should be fished with a very delicate landing where the fish actually sees the fly land. I think that, and frankly, that's a universal tip when it comes to dry fly fishing. A lot of people think that you want to run the longest drift you possibly can, but I've had 25 guides licenses. This is my 25th year of guiding, and I'm telling you, especially selective trout, if they can see that fly delicately land somewhere out in their horizon, I don't care whether it's an emerger or a terrestrial coming from the shore or a tree. If the fish sees the fly delicately light on the water, make a few little ripples isolated to just the fly, not your fly line and all that other crap you're throwing out there, the fish is much more likely to eat it. So when you present a dry fly or a crane fly, it's very critical, in my opinion, if you land the fly where the fish can see it. So if it's a spooky situation, not even a spooky situation, if it's a situation where you feel like you have a fish isolated into a very particular spot, and that could be one little piece of shade, one rock, one little riffle, one little depression or a little bucket in the river where you can't see the bottom, land that crane fly anywhere from 18 inches to 4 feet upstream, depending on how choppy it is. Let the fish see it delicately light on the water and fish it right from there. Don't mend it, don't mess around with it, don't give it a big punch mend. Let the fish make its own decision after seeing that fly light down at land. Much more than we can unpack here, but that's where having a decent reach cast or just a very sharp cast where you get good leader turnover is very, very critical. So we'll just round out the big dry fly selection with crane flies, and then I'll just add one more little thing at the end. having a nice tapered leader, I took this one out of the package here. Having a nice fresh tapered leader when you throw dry flies, in my opinion, is very important. It's knotless. You're not having to splice things together. When we start to patch leaders up and we get those knots can snag organic debris in the water like leaves, algae, grass, any type of debris floating in the water, those knots grab, and then people get a lot more tangles and get knotted up when there's actually knots in the leader. So start with a nice fresh tapered leader. If I had to choose one, I think it would be a 7.5 foot 4X for all of my fishing. If it was 1 leader, it's a hard decision, but you should have a nice fresh tapered leader to start most days. Tapered leader is maybe $4. The flies we're casting, if you're throwing nice flies, they may cost $4. Having a nice fresh leader to present that fly out there, you're gonna get nice turnover. It's a little sleeker when you mend, and a little bit better presentation with a nice fresh tapered leader as well. But a 7.5 foot 4X would be my preferred leader. But anything in that 9 5X down to 7.5 3, that general range is going to suit 90% of your dry fly fishing needs. So make sure to follow along. We'll release the nymph video here maybe in a week or so, and then another week after that we will talk streamers, the big stuff. So thanks for watching. Hopefully you've subscribed.